Science and the name of man had grammatology entered upon the assured path of a science. To be sure, techniques of deciphering went on progressing at an accelerated pace. But the general histories of writing, wherein devotion to systematic classification always oriented simple description, were to be governed for a long time by theoretical concepts that are clearly not commensurate with the great discoveries that should have shaken the most assured foundations of our philosophical conceptuality, entirely commanded by a situation determined by the relationships between logos and writing. All the great histories of writing open with an exposition of a classificatory and systematic project. But today one could transpose to the domain of writing what Jacobson says of languages since Schlegel's typological attempts, questions of typology retained a speculative, pre-scientific character for a long time. While genetic grouping of languages made amazing progress, the time was not yet ripe for their typological classification. OPCITP 69, *A systematic critique of the concepts used by historians of writing can seriously blame the rigidity or the insufficient differentiation of a theoretical apparatus only if it first locates the false evidence that guides the work. Evidence all the more efficacious because it belongs to the deepest, the oldest, and apparently the most natural, the least historical layer of our conceptuality, that which best eludes criticism, and especially because it supports that criticism, nourishes it, and informs it, our historical ground itself. In all histories or general typologies of writing may be encountered a concession analogous to the one that made Father Berger, author, in France, of the first big Histoire de l'écriture dans l'Antiquité, 1892, say, most often the facts do not conform to the distinctions which are only exact in theory, pxx. Yet, the issue was nothing less than the distinctions between phonetic and ideographic, syllabic and alphabetic, scripts, between image and symbol, etc. The same may be said of the instrumentalist and technicist concepts of writing, inspired by the phonetic model which it does not conform to except through a teleological illusion, and which the first contact with non-occidental scripts ought to have demolished. This instrumentalism is implicit everywhere. Nowhere is it as systematically formulated, with all the attendant consequences, as by Marcel Cohen, language being an instrument, writing is the extension to an instrument. 26 The exteriority of writing to speech, of speech to thought, of the signifier to the signified in general, could not be described better. There is much food for thought in the matter of the price thus paid by a linguistics or by a grammatology which, in this case, professes to be Marxist, to the metaphysical tradition. The same tribute may be identified everywhere, logocentric teleology, a pleonastic expression, opposition between nature and institution, play of differences between symbol, sign, image, etc., a naive concept of representation, an uncritical opposition between sensible and intelligible, between soul and body, an objectivist concept of the body proper core proper and of the diversity of sensory functions, the five senses considered as so many apparatuses at the disposition of the speaker or writer, opposition between analysis and synthesis, abstract and concrete, which plays a decisive role in the classification as proposed by Fevrier and Cohen and in the debate that opposes them, a concept of the concept upon which the most classical philosophic reflection has left little mark, a reference to consciousness and to the unconscious which would necessarily invoke a more vigilant use of these notions and some consideration for those studies that make these notions their theme. 27 A notion of the sign that philosophy, linguistics, and semiology illuminate rarely and feebly. The competition between the history of writing and the science of language is sometimes experienced in terms of hostility rather than collaboration. Supposing, of course, that the competition is admitted. Thus, apropos of the great distinction operated by Fevrier between synthetic writing and analytic writing, as also apropos of the word which plays for him a central role, the author notes, the problem is of the order of linguistics, we shall not deal with it here, OPCIT, p. 49. Elsewhere, the non-communication with linguistics is justified by Fevrier in these terms, of grammatology as a positive science. Mathematics is a special language which no longer has any relationship with language, it is a sort of universal language, that is to say we ascertain through mathematics that language vengeance upon linguists is absolutely incapable of accommodating certain forms of modern thought. And at present it is writing, so badly misunderstood, that takes the place of language, after having been its servant, EP, p. 349. It can be shown that these presuppositions and all the oppositions thus accredited form a system, we circulate from one to the other within the same structure. Not only does the theory of writing need an intrascientific and epistemological liberation, analogous to the one brought about by FNRET and Warburton, without touching the layers of which we speak there. Now a reflection must clearly be undertaken, within which the positive discovery and the deconstruction of the history of metaphysics, in all its concepts, are controlled reciprocally, minutely, laboriously. Without this, any epistemological liberation would risk being illusory or limited, proposing merely practical conveniences or notional simplifications on bases that are untouched by criticism. Such is undoubtedly the limitation of the remarkable enterprise of one. J. Gelb, OPCIT, in spite of immense progress and the project of erecting a grammatological scientificity and creating a unified system of simple, supple, and manageable notions, in spite of the exclusion of inadequate concepts such as of the ideogram, most of the conceptual oppositions that I have just cited continue to function there securely. Through all the recent work in the area, one glimpses the future extensions of a grammatology called upon to stop receiving its guiding concepts from other human sciences or, what nearly always amounts to the same thing, from traditional metaphysics. A grammatology may be surmised through the wealth and novelty of information, as well as through the treatment of this information, even if, in these pioneering works, the conceptualization often falls short of a bold and confident thrust. What seems to announce itself now is, on the one hand, that grammatology must not be one of the sciences of man and, on the other hand, that it must not be just one regional science among others. It ought not to be one of the sciences of man, because it asks first, as its characteristic question, the question of the name of man. To free unity from the concept of man is undoubtedly to renounce the old notion of people said to be without writing and without history. André Leroy-Gourhan shows it well, to refuse the name of man and the ability to write beyond its own proper community, is one and the same gesture. Actually, the people said to be without writing lack only a certain type of writing. To refuse the name of writing to this or that technique of consignment is the ethnocentrism that best defines the prescientific vision of man and at the same time results in the fact that in many human groups, the only word by which the members designate their ethnic group is the word man. GP 11, pages 32 and passim, but it is not enough to denounce ethnocentrism and to define anthropological unity by the disposition of writing. Leroy-Gourhan no longer describes the unity of man and the human adventure thus by the simple possibility of the graphy in general, rather as a stage or an articulation in the history of life of what I have called difference as the history of the gram. Instead of having recourse to the concepts that habitually serve to distinguish man from other living beings, instinct and intelligence, absence or presence of speech, of society, of economy, etc., the notion of program is invoked. It must of course be understood in the cybernetic sense, but cybernetics is itself intelligible only in terms of a history of the possibilities of the trace as the unity of a double movement of protension and retention. This movement goes far beyond the possibilities of the intentional consciousness. It is an emergence that makes the gram appear as such, that is to say according to a new structure of non-presence, and undoubtedly makes possible the emergence of the systems of writing in the narrow sense. Since genetic inscription and the short programmatic chains regulating the behavior of the amoeba or the annelid up to the passage beyond alphabetic writing to the orders of the logos and of a certain Homo sapiens, the possibility of the gram structures the movement of its history according to rigorously original levels, types, and rhythms. Point 28. But one cannot think them without the most general concept of the gram. That is irreducible and impregnable. If the expression ventured by Leroy-Gourhan is accepted, one could speak of a liberation of memory, of an exteriorization always already begun but always larger than the trace which, beginning from the elementary programs of so-called instinctive behavior up to the constitution of electronic card indexes and reading machines, enlarges difference and the possibility of putting in reserve, it at once and in the same movement constitutes and effaces so-called conscious subjectivity, its logos, and its theological attributes. The history of writing is erected on the base of the history of the gram as an adventure of relationships between the face and the hand. Here, by a precaution whose schema we must constantly repeat, let us specify that the history of writing is not explained by what we believe we know of the face and the hand, of the glance, of the spoken word, and of the gesture. We must, on the contrary, disturb this familiar knowledge, and awaken a meaning of hand and face in terms of that history. Leroy-Gourhan describes the slow transformation of manual motricity which frees the audiophonic system for speech, and the glance and the hand for writing. Point 29. In all these descriptions, it is difficult to avoid the mechanist, technicist, and teleological language at the very moment when it is precisely a question of retrieving the origin and the possibility of movement, of the machine, of grammatology as a positive science technique, of orientation in general. In fact, it is not difficult, it is essentially impossible. And this is true of all discourse. From one discourse to another, the difference lies only in the mode of inhabiting the interior of a conceptuality destined, or already submitted, to decay. Within that conceptuality or already without it, we must attempt to recapture the unity of gesture and speech, of body and language, of tool and thought, before the originality of the one and the other is articulated and without letting this profound unity give rise to confusionism. These original significations must not be confused within the orbit of the system where they are opposed. But to think the history of the system, its meaning and value must, in an exorbitant way, be somewhere exceeded. This representation of the anthropo is then granted, a precarious balance linked to manual visual script. Point 30. This balance is slowly threatened. It is at least known that no major change giving birth to a man of the future who will no longer be a man, can be easily produced without the loss of the hand, the teeth, and therefore of the upright position. A toothless humanity that would exist in a prone position using what limbs it had left to push buttons with, is not completely inconceivable. 1e31. What always threatens this balance is confused with the very thing that broaches the linearity of the symbol. We have seen that the traditional concept of time, an entire organization of the world and of language, was bound up with it. Writing in the narrow sense and phonetic writing above all is rooted in a past of nonlinear writing. It had to be defeated, and here one can speak, if one wishes, of technical success. It assured a greater security and greater possibilities of capitalization in a dangerous and anguishing world. But that was not done one single time. A war was declared, and a suppression of all that resisted linearization was installed. And first of what Leroy-Gourhan calls the mythogram, a writing that spells its symbols p1 unidimensionally, there the meaning is not subjected to successivity, to the order of a logical time, or to the irreversible temporality of sound. This p1 unidimensionality does not paralyze history within simultaneity, it corresponds to another level of historical experience, and one may just as well consider, conversely, linear thought as a reduction of history. It is true that another word ought perhaps to be used. The word history has no doubt always been associated with a linear scheme of the unfolding of presence, where the line relates the final presence to the originary presence according to the straight line or the circle. For the same reason, the pluridimensional one symbolic structure is not given within the category of the simultaneous. Simultaneity coordinates two absolute presence, 2 points, or instants of presence, and it remains a linearist concept. The concept of linearization is much more effective, faithful, and intrinsic than those that are habitually used for classifying scripts and describing their history, pictogram, ideogram, letter, etc. Exposing more than one prejudice, particularly about the relationship between ideogram and pictogram, about so-called graphic realism, Leroy-Gourhan recalls the unity, within the mythogram, of all the elements of which linear writing marks the disruption, techniques, particularly graphics, art, religion, economy. To recover the access to this unity, to this other structure of unity, we must sediment FO over 1,000 years of linear writing. 32. The linear norm was never able to impose itself absolutely for the very reasons that intrinsically circumscribed graphic phoneticism. We now know them. These limits came into being at the same time as the possibility of what they limited. They opened what they finished, and we have already named them: discreteness, difference, spacing. The production of the linear norm thus emphasized these limits and marked the concepts of symbol and language. The process of linearization, as Leroy-Gourhan describes it on a very vast historical scale, and the Jacobsonian critique of Saussure's linearist concept, must be thought of together. The line represents only a particular model, whatever might be its privilege. This model has become a model and, as a model, it remains inaccessible. If one allows that the linearity of language entails this vulgar and mundane concept of temporality, homogeneous, dominated by the form of the now and the ideal of continuous movement, straight or circular, which Heidegger shows to be the intrinsic determining concept of all ontology from Aristotle to Hegel, the meditation upon writing and the deconstruction of the history of philosophy become inseparable. The enigmatic model of the line is thus the very thing that philosophy could not see when it had its eyes open on the interior of its own history. This night begins to lighten a little at the moment when linearity, which is not loss or absence but the repression of pluridimensionality, 33 symbolic thought relaxes its oppression because it begins to sterilize the technical and scientific economy that it has long favored. In fact, for a long time its possibility has been structurally bound up with that of economy, of technics, and of ideology. This solidarity appears in the process of thesaurization, capitalization, sedentarization, hierarchization, of the formation of ideology by the class that writes or rather commands the scribes. 34 Not that the massive reappearance of nonlinear writing interrupts this structural solidarity, quite the contrary. But it transforms its nature profoundly. The end of linear writing is indeed the end of the book. 35 Even if, even today, it is within the form of a book that new writings, literary or theoretical, allow themselves to be, for better or for worse, encased. It is less a question of confiding new writings to the envelope of a book than of finally reading what wrote itself between the lines in the volumes. That is why, beginning to write without the line, one begins also to reread past writing according to a different organization of space. If today the problem of grammatology as a positive sciencing occupies the forefront of science, it is because of the suspense between two ages of writing. Because we are beginning to write differently, we must reread differently. For over a century, this uneasiness has been evident in philosophy, in science, in literature. All the revolutions in these fields can be interpreted as shocks that are gradually destroying the linear model, which is to say the epic model. What is thought today cannot be written according to the line and the book, except by imitating the operation implicit in teaching modern mathematics with an abacus. This inadequation is not modern, but it is exposed today better than ever before. The access to pluridimensionality and to a delinearized temporality is not a simple regression toward the mythogram. On the contrary, it makes all the rationality subjected to the linear model appear as another form and another age of mythography. The meta-rationality or the meta-scientificity which are thus announced within the meditation upon writing can therefore be no more shut up within a science of man than conform to the traditional idea of science. In one and the same gesture, they leave man, science, and the line behind. Even less can this meditation be contained within the limits of a regional science.